Welcome to the Arizona Author Series. This event was recorded on March 2nd, 2023. This Arizona Author Series is supported by the Arizona State Library Archives and Public Records, a division of Secretary of State, with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are pleased to hear from Wynne Brown, author of the book The Forgotten Botanist, Sara Plummer Lemmon's Life of Science and Art. Wynne Brown is a freelance writer, editor, and graphic designer based in Tucson on the Arizona lands of the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Pasquayaqui tribe. Her recent book, The Forgotten Botanist, Sara Plummer Lemmon's Life of Science and Art from the University of Nebraska Press, was selected as a Southwest Books of the Year top pick and won both the Spur Award for Best Western Biography and the Willa Literary Award for Creative Nonfiction, among others. Her other award-winning books include Remarkable Arizona Women, The Falcon Guide to Trail Riding Arizona, and Cave Creek Canyon, revealing the heart of Arizona's Chiricahua Mountains. She is also the president of Chiricahua Regional Council, the Pima County representative to the State Board of the Arizona Historical Society, and she was the 2022 Spring Pima County Public Library Writer in Residence. We are pleased to hear from Ms. Brown and glad you can join us.
Right. Jan, thank you so much for that introduction and especially for inviting me. You know, it's always a treat to talk about Sara Lemmon, but it's a special treat to this group because I am hugely indebted to librarians and archivists. This entire project literally would not exist if it hadn't been for archives and the archivists that I've relied on. And let's see why that one's not working. There we go. As Jan mentioned, I'm a writer, editor, graphic designer, and basically I kind of think of myself as a three-legged stool. These are just a few of the books that I've worked on, either as a writer, editor, illustrator, designer, or project manager, or some combination of all of those. And I can't resist telling a story about one of them. The one in the top row center, Remarkable Arizona Women, just came out. This is actually the third edition. The first two editions are just below it. And you'll notice that the first two editions had a major series title. This was a national series. There was one for every state. And the series title used to be More Than Petticoats, and then it was Remarkable Arizona Women or Nebraska Women. And I noticed that it no longer has that title. And I think I get some of the credit for that because I had a huge fight with Amazon because they insisted on putting More Than Petticoats, Remarkable Arizona Women in the underwear department of the website. So I'm just as happy that petticoats is no longer part of the title. And all of these books are available wherever you buy books, or most of them are. And I do encourage people to use independent bookstores. My background, kind of like Sara's actually, is a mix of journalism, science, and scientific illustration. But, you know, I've always been really interested in intersections, those Venn diagrams where different disciplines meet and at least sometimes mingle. And I think that explains a lot of my fascination with Sara Lemmon. But even more than that, I really think of myself primarily as a storyteller. To me, stories are the connective tissue, and they attach us to our land or to our forebears, or even into our entire culture, whether that be local or global. You can see more about the tools that I use to tell those stories at my website, and not surprisingly, it's wynnebrown.com. That red arrow is to remind me to tell you that on the resource tab, I've added I have a page called Writers Resources, and I've added a section for historical research tools. And if you have any suggestions for things that I should add to that, I'm happy to do that. So this particular story of The Forgotten Botanist lies right at the intersection of art and science. And to me, even though it's been out now for a year and a half, it's still thrilling because it's done very well. It's the first printing sold out in 6 months. It's now well through its second printing, and it's won 7 different awards. What we're going to do this afternoon is that I'll first give you a brief overview of the project itself, kind of the story behind the story of Sara and her exquisite artwork. And as part of that, because this group is who you are, I'm going to share some of the tools that I found invaluable for wrangling 7 years worth of data. Then I'll zip through a bare bones timeline of Sara's packed productive life, and we'll look at just a few of the plants that Sara collected in the southern Arizona area or that were named for her. And then to wrap up, you'll see what's next for her work with a very recent update that just happened this morning. And I'll be happy to take questions at the end. When I started all this, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It's actually pretty hard to believe that it was 20 years ago that I first learned that Arizona's Mount Lemmon is named for a woman botanist of the 1800s who climbed it on her honeymoon in her 40s. So that was pretty intriguing. Then in 2012, I learned that the University of California and Jepson Herbaria Archives in Berkeley, California, has 6 linear feet of material on the lemons. I didn't know if it was all field notes or if it was drawings or letters, but my first thought was, somebody ought to do a book on that. Well, I now know there lie monsters among those words. So I finally got there in 2015, and it turns out that much of that 6 feet of material was letters. In fact, it was 1,200 pages of letters. Talk about a gift to historians, and you can see why I'm so grateful to archives. Sara Plummer was very close to her family. She wrote home every week, mostly to her father and to her younger sister, Maddie, which stood for Martha Plummer. I made a total of 3 trips to the Jepson Herbaria Archives in Berkeley to photograph all 1,200 pages of Sara's letters. Paper, she often wrote across her own handwriting. So she'd write on one side of the page, flip it over, write on the back side, flip it back over, turn it sideways, and write across her own handwriting. That was something that was quite common at the time, called cross-writing. So at this point, I hadn't even started the book, and I already had dozens and dozens of references. I had titles of books and articles and websites and images and scraps of text, and I had to figure out some way of trying to corral all this material. And Scrivener, it came to my rescue. Besides, how can you not love a company that's called Literature and Latte? As software goes, Scrivener is really cheap. It's $49. That's a one-time, not every month fee, and it's available for either Macs or PCs. It's even available for your phone. I can't imagine anything much worse than wrangling this particular book on my phone, but some people like to do that. Some people also like Scrivener for writing. I tried that and it worked fine, but it was too confusing to both work in Word and in Scrivener to write. But it does also have a facility where you can move scenes around, like a cork board. So this is a screenshot from Scrivener, and you could think of it as a filing cabinet with many, many, many folders, or as a huge, infinitely expandable binder. And on the left, you can see all these different folders, and you can have as many folders as you need to. And then when you zoom in on one of them, it'll open, and here you can see the page from the Genealogical and Memorial New England Family Record. Here is another example. Maybe, there we go. Of zooming in to the Catalina folder and where I wanted to capture the reference about Tagetes lemoni, one of the plants that the lemons discovered here in the Catalinas. So for me, Scrivener has been an absolute lifesaver. So I not only followed the letters, I also followed Sara's artwork. And this particular slide gets us a little deeper into the Plummer family history. You've already met Sara's younger sister, Maddie. Well, Maddie had a daughter, Sara's niece, who confusingly was also named Maddie. Maddie Jr. married a man whose last name was St. John, and they had a son, Harold St. John, who's shown in this slide. He was Sarah's grandnephew. Harold grew up to be a noted botanist in Hawaii, and in fact, the St. John Plant Science Laboratory at the University of Hawaii is named for him. And when his mother, Maddie Jr., died, boxes of Sarah's paintings and letters ended up stored in his attic. When he died, his granddaughter, Amy St. John, did the best she could to conserve the material. She had it shipped from Honolulu to California, where she lived. And then in 2015, she donated all of that material to the archives in Berkeley. And it's worth remembering that anything that's shipped from Hawaii to the mainland has to either be frozen or fumigated. So as you look at this material, you have to remember it's had quite the journey. So here are the 2 boxes of paintings that Amy shipped from Hawaii to California and were eventually donated. All of the works, the paintings that are in these 2 boxes are on paper, and because of both their age and Hawaii's humidity, they're so fragile that the archivists were even reluctant to handle them or even count them because they were afraid that the paper would just crumble. To me, it was tragic that these really exquisite and incredibly fragile watercolors were crowded into these 2 boxes and didn't have protective sheets in between. And of course, times being what they are, the university had no money to do anything with them. And in 2016, when this picture was taken, we all thought these 2 boxes contained all that was left of Sarah's artwork. And as of this summer, we now know that we were wrong, but I'll get back to that. So in the meantime, I was dying to see what was in those boxes. And plus, I really wanted to get photographs of the artwork for the book that I had not yet written, and I didn't even yet have a contract for. But optimistically, a year later, in 2017, I hired Susan Filter, a local Berkeley art conservator, for one day to assess the work. And that way I could photograph it at the same time. And a very highly experienced art conservator does not come cheap. Susan's fee was $1,500 for one day. It was a very long day. At one point, we had no idea, when we started, we had absolutely no idea how many pieces there were in the boxes, and it turned out to be 276 pieces of artwork. So Susan and my husband, Dave Peterson, and I spent a long day numbering, listing, and photographing every one of those 276 pieces, both front and back, because there's a wealth of information written on the back of many of them. And 20 of those paintings, I'm happy to say, are reproduced in the Forgotten Botanist, and they're reproduced in color. I mentioned that they were very fragile. They'd been stored in Hawaii, and you can see in this one how very damaged it is. Here's some really horrific insect damage. And that day, as we looked at all those way back in 2017, I resolved that somehow I would make it possible for these delicate and fragile pieces of art to be stored more safely. And this isn't what you would call art restoration. The accurate technical term for this is that the work needs to be stabilized and rehoused, and we'll get more into that in a little bit. But in the meantime, how was I going to keep track of these 276 pieces of work and all the information that was on them? And what I'm doing for now is using Excel. It's temporary because Excel is not meant to be a database program, but all of this data will eventually get moved into the Jepson Archives database program. But for now, this is adequate for my needs. It includes a thumbnail of the artwork, the assigned image number, the plant ID, the plant location, and any other information, including who the artist was, because it turned out that not all the paintings were by Sara, and that's another story. So this is what I refer to as the project brain. I needed a way to log all the letters, which turned out in itself to be a 2-year project. All it is a simple word table, but it's also a threefer. It's a timeline of Sara's life through her own words. It's and also with national global events for context. It was a way for me to track which content was in which images which photographs of which letters, and it was kind of a progress report. So yes, it's simple, but it's not small. It's in 9-point type. It takes up 43 pages and it's 40,000 words. And here's just a sample page. It includes the year and the month, a summary of what the letter was about, the image number, so I can go back and track the actual photograph of the actual letter. And here's just one reason that I'm really glad I did this. And you all who are interested in librarians and archivists will appreciate this story, I think. Last year, a retired English teacher in Japan emailed me. He had just read the book. He loved the book. And he also pointed out that on page 29, I wrote that Sara had asked Maddie, her sister Maddie, to send a copy of The Wind and the Willows for her new library. And if you happen to have a copy of the book nearby, and if it happens to be the first printing, check it out. Because you'll see, sure enough, there, 1/3 of the way down the page, it says that Sara asked for The Wind and the Willows. And this very nice man pointed out, oh, so politely, that Sara wrote that letter in 1871, but The Wind and the Willows was not published until 1908. Uh-oh. So my first thought was, oh, surely he's wrong. But no, he was absolutely right. But sure enough, if you go to page 8 of the Project Brain, it says Wind in the Willows. And I misspelled willow. I was so excited because I love The Wind and the Willow. And I think in my brain wanted that to be included. But it also says it's image 2463, there's a duplicate, and that particular letter was 540 words. So here's image 2463 on my hard drive, and there is Sara's letter of May 1st, 1871, written from Santa Barbara. So hooray, the system works. And let's zoom in. Oh, look. Talk about wishful transcription. It's not The Wind and the Willows. It actually says Under the Willows, and I misread it. Well, I'd never heard of Under the Willows. So, of course, I ran to Google. And the first entry that came up is Under the Willows, which turns out to be a fast-paced paranormal mystery published in 2020. I'm guessing most likely this is not the one that Sara was referring to. So I kept digging. Aha. James Russell Lowell was a poet, a New Englander, a Unitarian, and an abolitionist, just like Sara. The chances are excellent that they knew each other. So I'm very grateful to the kindly English teacher in Japan who was reading so carefully, and I'm very grateful to the Project, the Brain. The next step was figuring out how to do the book, and I'll spare you most of the nuts and bolts details about book publication, because that's a whole different talk, except to say that because this book is nonfiction, publishers require a book proposal. And book proposals are almost as much work as the eventual manuscript. My proposal for this book is 100 pages. And over the next 2 years, I submitted my proposal to 24 different agents, commercial publishers, and academic presses, and nobody wanted it. But fortunately, finally, on October 2019, I signed a contract with the University of Nebraska Press, and they should have been #1 on my list. The entire process with UNP has been completely fantastic, and I'm especially pleased that it's a Bison book, which is their trade imprint for general interest readers. So then all I had to do was write the book, and as you can see, I have excellent office help. A year after submitting the final copy-edited manuscript, UPS delivered the first box of books in October 2021. And even though this was not my first book, it was still incredibly exciting. So now let's dive a little deeper into the story of the woman botanist and artist who's the engine that drives this entire project. Sara Allen Plummer Lemmon, for whom Arizona's own Mount Lemmon is named. She was born in New Gloucester, Maine, September 3rd, 1836. So this next September will be her 187th birthday. She was the middle child of 5. You already know about her younger sister, Maddie, and she also had 2 older brothers and a younger one. Here's a picture of Maddie and their father. So quite a few years later, her father was Micah Jaw Sawyer Plummer. And in those 1,200 pages of letters, there's only one that's from Sara to her mother, Betsy Haskell Plummer. And all I know about that is that Betsy had some significant health problems. So, and maybe she was not the keeper of correspondence that Maddie was. At the age of 20, Sara left home to attend the Ladies Collegiate Institute in Worcester, Mass., where she earned a certificate in teaching calisthenics, which is what we now know as gym class. That's actually pretty ironic because her health had always been fragile. She'd been kind of a sickly child. She always had colds and bronchitis. So it's interesting that she chose to teach gym. In 1861, she moved to Brooklyn, New York. She graduated from the Greenleaf Female Institute with honors, doubly certified in chemistry and physics. Then in 1862, she was accepted to the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. And there she studied chemistry and physics at night while teaching calisthenics in the gym in the public school system. And she also taught art lessons, private art lessons, because she had always been artistically talented. She loved her life in New York City, and she was constantly busy. She was teaching and soaking up all the intellectual and artistic opportunities, hanging out with progressives, poets, suffragettes. And in a really interesting bit of foreshadowing, she also made time to volunteer at New York's Bellevue Hospital as a nurse for wounded Civil War soldiers. And this is where she may have crossed paths with Clara Barton for the first time. And of course, Clara Barton would go on to establish the American Red Cross. Again, the fact that Sara worked in the hospital is incredibly ironic because she had terrible respiratory problems by now. She had constantly bronchitis, constant colds, and in 1863, she also nearly died of measles that she undoubtedly caught at the hospital. In 1870, she nearly died again, this time of pneumonia, and she realized that her entire life depended on escaping the bitter northeastern winters. So she made the huge decision to move across the country all by herself to California, where she didn't know a single soul. And this was not an easy jaunt. The railroad was not appropriate for a single lady traveling alone. It had been established, the Golden Spike had been hammered in, but it wasn't appropriate for a single lady. So she went the long way around, the really long way, by steamship, down the coast, across the Isthmus of Panama, and then all the way up the coast of Mexico. And she finally disembarked in San Francisco. She stayed for a month and then realized that her lungs were still not up to the cold and damp. So she headed south to Santa Barbara. And when she got there in 1870, the population was 2,970, a little different than what it is now. Santa Barbara was lovely. The climate was idyllic, especially compared to Manhattan's winters, but the intellectual stimulation was a far cry from New York City. And this is when she wrote to her sister Maddie, "It is like death to me to be idle," which almost became the title of the book. But worse yet, there was no library. So Sara, being Sara, rounded up donations and hundreds of books and established Santa Barbara's first library. She also sold art supplies and had magazines from all over the world. As she gradually recovered her health, she took long walks along the beach and in the hills above Santa Barbara. She had always been insatiably curious, particularly about natural history, so she taught herself botany by using her artistic ability. And this is the earliest surviving painting that's been found so far. It's probably some sort of flowering fruit tree, maybe an apple. And you might wonder about all those brown spots. That's the kind of damage that happens with artwork that's 140 years old. And it's called foxing. They're possibly fungus damage from the humidity in Hawaii, or it could be rust spots from tiny metal fragments in the paper. Sara still missed the stimulation of New York City, so she also set up a lecture series, and that may be what brought this man to Santa Barbara. John Gill Lemmon, who usually went by J.G. Lemmon, was born in Michigan in 1832, 4 years before Sara. He became a teacher, and then he became the county superintendent of schools. He'd started attending classes at the University of Michigan until enlisting in the Union Army in the Civil War in June of 1862. He was in 32 battles in between working as an Army nurse, and then he was captured in August of 1864. He was first sent to the infamous Andersonville prison in Georgia, and as if that wasn't horrendous enough, he was later sent to the Florence Stockade in South Carolina, where, if possible, the conditions were even worse than Andersonville. The photo on the left is J.G. Lemmon, and you can see his different battles around the edge. The one on the right is not, but it's typical of what the very few survivors of Andersonville looked like when they were released. J.G. was released in 1865 at the end of the war, and he wrote later that after, quote, a year of liberal diet, his weight had increased to 90 pounds. And this was a man who was unusually tall. He was 6 feet tall. With his mother's help, and she's quite the story herself, J.G. moved to Northern California to recuperate at his brother's ranch in Sierra Valley, which is just north of Truckee. J.G. had always been interested in botany, and he started teaching himself the Western plants. The ones he didn't know, he sent to Harvard University's Dr. Asa Gray, and Asa Gray was the preeminent American botanist at the time. I call this my bounty of mostly bearded botanists slide. Edward Green over there on the left apparently didn't get the memo about the beard, but it helps to have a little context of what was happening in the botany world of the 1870s. At that time, you could visualize the botany world as kind of a planetary rather than planetary system with all of these significant botanists orbiting their way around Asa Gray. And this was a time of frenetic botanic activity. All these men were in frequent communication with one another, and any of you who were gardeners will recognize many of their names. Torrey Pine, the Engelmann Spruce, Parry's Penstemon. And by this time, Sara Plummer had educated herself to become a knowledgeable amateur botanist in her own right, and both she and J.G. corresponded with all of these men as well. And some years later, they would spend much of their time socializing with John Muir and Charles Parry. So J.G. and Miss Plummer, the town librarian, started botanizing together in the hills above Santa Barbara, always, of course, chaperoned. J.G. became smitten with Sara to the point where, when she was the first person to discover this particular plant, he asked Asa Gray to name it for her, and it's still called Plummer's Baccharis in honor of her maiden name. A year later, J.G. worked up the courage to propose to Sara, but she turned him down, saying that she loved him deeply, but she felt that they were both too sick too often to marry. And he was devastated. So the two remained affectionate pen pals for the next several years. Then Sara got sick again, this time with spinal meningitis in 1880. She nearly died, and apparently that changed her mind because they were married on Thanksgiving Day, 1880, or as Sara described it to Maddie, they plunged into the matrimonial vortex. She was 44 and J.G. was 48. She relocated from Santa Barbara to Oakland, and she moved in with J.G. and his mother. They resolved, at Sara's suggestion, that, as J.G. wrote later, instead of, quote, idling our time in useless saunterings and listening to silly gossip, they would delay their honeymoon until the growing season, when they would make a grand botanical raid into Arizona and try to touch the heart of the Santa Catalina. So here's a map of where they were headed. So in April 1881, they arrived in Tucson by train and set up camp in the foothills north of Fort Lowell. And I like to think that they were somewhere close to where the Sabino Canyon Visitor Center is now. They then spent the next 2.5 weeks struggling to get to the top of the range from the south side, from the side that faces Tucson, and they failed 3 times. And as you look at this terrain, you have to wonder, what on earth were these people thinking? Every time I drive up to Mount Lemmon, I'm just astonished that they would even consider this. But they spent 2 weeks trying to reach the top, and they finally gave up. Within a couple of weeks, they went back to town. They got in touch with Emerson Oliver Stratton, who owned the Pandora Ranch, which was on the north side of the Santa Catalinas. Stratton knew a route to the top, although he'd never been there, and provided pack animals, and the three of them made their way up to the top. Years later, he wrote, "We went to the highest peak of the Santa Catalinas and christened it Mount Lemmon in honor of Mrs. Lemmon, who was the first white woman up there." The following year, 1882, they returned to Arizona because they went back to Oakland to spend the winter. And this time they were based at Fort Huachuca, and they spent several months there. They were in what was then known as Tanner's Canyon, now Garden Canyon. And this is the time and place where Sara did most of the surviving paintings, or what I thought was most of them until the summer. And this was really, I think, this time in the Huachucas, they just loved it, and they called it a botanical paradise. And I think in many ways, their Arizona adventures were the highlight of their lives together. There are, as many of you know, many plants with the species name of lemoni, but the ones I'm going to show you now are just a few of the Arizona plants that are named specifically for Sara, such as this Plummer's cliff fern. And it was collected for the first time in the Chiricahua Mountains on September 24th, 1881. I think it's also well worth remembering that in 1884, 3 years after this plant was collected, Asa Gray wrote in a paper that, quote, "Whenever the name of lemon is cited for Arizonian plants, it in fact refers to the pair of most enthusiastic botanists." So here's another one that's named for Sara, this really beautiful little morning glory. First specimen was collected by her in 1882. And here's another one. This is a stevia, the same group of plants that you might use to sweeten your tea. Here's one that's not named for Sara, but it's another specimen that was actually collected by Sara from the Huachucas. And again, thanks to archives, we were able to see it while visiting the Nebraska State Museum. This particular plant, Eutropha macrorrhiza, is a nettle spurge, and you can see the label, which is written in Sara's very distinctive handwriting. And after reading 1,200 pages of her letters, I'm pretty familiar with her handwriting. I do also want to point out that all the plant labels, if you look at the bottom, say J.G. Lemmon and wife. I'll spare you the feminist rant, except to say that this was just typical of the times, and that actually several authorities believe that it was actually Sara who did much of the botanical work that was credited to J.G. because he was so devastated by his war wounds. And here's a picture of the actual plant. It's very handsome, and this particular one is about waist high. And here is Sara's painting of it. And it's hard to see in this slide, but it's signed at the bottom. And it also says that it was done in Fort Huachuca, June, July of 1882. This one also, you can see, has some foxing on it. Here's another one that's from the Huachucas, Tanner's Canyon, which she did September 13th, 1882, and it's signed on the bottom. And miraculously, this one has absolutely no damage to it at all. No foxing, no insect damage at all. Here's a columbine, also from the Huachucas, and also signed on the bottom. The following year, 1883, they again came back to Arizona for the growing season, and this time they went to both the Catalinas and the Huachucas. And Sara wrote that they stayed on the Cactus Ranch north of Tucson, but they were poisoned by the well water. They then wanted to move on to Fort Huachuca, but there was an outbreak of yellow fever there. So instead, they stayed at the Igo Ranch at the north end of the Huachucas. And that was where she did this particular painting. And those of you who've seen the front of the book will recognize it. The UNP chose it for the cover of the book, which I just love. The next year, 1884, they were on the train from California and happened to meet a man named John Willard Young. He was the son of Brigham Young, who had built Fort Moroni near Flagstaff, and he invited them to stay at his ranch. They remained as his guests for much of the summer, and this is one of the paintings that she did from there. It's the whole-leafed Indian paintbrush. And on the back, she wrote Kendrick's Mountain, Northern Arizona, 1884. The reason they were on the train is because they were on their way to New Orleans, because Sara was in charge of organizing the Pacific Slope section of what was then known as the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition, which is a really long-winded way of saying the World's Fair. They spent 6 months there, and probably they spent most of their spare time hanging out with Clara Barton and her field agent, Dr. Julian Hubble. That's where the two couples became good friends. They remained good friends for the rest of their lives. And Clara and Julian even came out to California and camped with the Lemmons later. From then on, generally, the Lemmons were out in the field during the growing season collecting plants. They then spent winters at their herbarium in Oakland, eking out a living by selling specimens and seeds to collectors. They produced several books illustrated by Sara and did frequent botany lectures. In 1903, because they had always rented until now, but in 1903, they packed up everything and moved into what would become their last home, and they actually owned this one. And this photo always makes me feel much better about the mess in my office. Here's the home from the outside, and if you look carefully, you can see over the porch, it says the Lemmon Herbarium, and it was on at 5985 Telegraph Avenue. Remarkably, the house still stands, although it could certainly use a little love, but it's still there on Telegraph Avenue, very close to campus, and it's next door to a scuba store. And that weird little windmill thing used to be a coffee kiosk. Sara remained passionate about healthcare. She was also very active in the Red Cross. She wrote the history of the Pacific Slope Red Cross, which was no small accomplishment because it's 486 pages with many photographs. I also discovered that she quietly established the first training school for nurses on the West Coast, and yet she never even mentioned that in any of her letters. She was a frequent speaker about the importance of forest conservation, and she also spoke often at women's suffrage events. If you ask a Californian, they would tell you that Sara Lemmon's most well-known accomplishment was in 1903 after a 10-year battle when the golden poppy was named as California's state flower. I think a lot of Arizonans might think that having a mountain named for you is a bigger deal, but then I'm biased. In June of 1905, the Lemmons returned to Tucson. They hunted up Emerson Stratton, and the following month, the three of them retraced their steps on 5 burros in honor of J.G. and Sara's 25th wedding anniversary. She wrote here at the top of this postcard, both well and happy on this, our silver wedding journey. We sleep in the open air beside a delicious mountain stream that sings our nightly lullaby. They would have had a hard time doing that today. Mount Lemmon got 12 inches of snow last night, and we even had snow in Midtown Tucson. She was 70 and he was 74. By now, Sara had made hundreds of paintings, and the question is, where are they? And I'm afraid I might have an answer to that question. Sara was the second female member of the until then all-male California Academy of Sciences. She was then the first woman allowed to speak to the group, and after breaking that barrier, she was at the Academy Herbarium and archives frequently. In their letters, both she and J.G. often referred to sending their specimens there, as well as many of her illustrations. And as many of you know, at 5:12 a.m., April 18th, was the San Francisco earthquake. And as if the earthquake wasn't bad enough, fires gutted the California Academy of Sciences, along with many, many other buildings. and many, so many hundreds of specimens were lost. And so the question is, were her paintings among them? She was really, I think the two of them were shattered. They did write that we are safe, though tremendously shaken, but they were just shattered by the loss of so much of their work. And JG's health, which was already so fragile, continued to decline over the next year, and he lost much of his vision. He then died of pneumonia in November of 1908, 2 days before their 28th wedding anniversary. After he was gone, Sara never really recovered. In fact, Maddie believed that Sara's cognitive decline began with the trauma of the earthquake. The family finally reluctantly committed Sara to Stockton State Hospital on April 22nd, 1916, and the diagnosis was dementia. It was just really tragic. This brilliant woman became profane, and had to be prevented from leaving the house, as they said, unclad. She died January 15th, 1923, 100 years ago. And the two of them are buried together in Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California, under a gravestone that reads, "Partners in Botany." One thing I love about this picture is that because of COVID, I couldn't get back to Oakland to photograph the headstone in time for the book deadline. So Sara's great-great-grandniece, Amy St. John, took this photo for me for the book. But what about all those paintings? Thanks to an especially generous $3,500 donation from Sabino Canyon volunteer naturalists, along with some other donations, and with all of my speaking fees and royalties, there was enough funding for us to return to Berkeley this summer. And that money covered 3 days of Susan Filter's fee because she came out of retirement. And it also paid for all the materials needed to rehouse those 276 paintings. And then we discovered that, or the archivists discovered that in a back closet, perhaps because they were much bigger boxes, they had amazing news for us. 2 more boxes had shown up that had been stored elsewhere. And you can see in this top photo, the original boxes down here with the 276 paintings, and then these are the 2 new boxes that had shown up. And nobody had actually looked at these. In this lower image, you can see what we now call Team Sara at work. Amy Kassemeyer on the left is the archivist, Susan Filter, the conservator, and Amy St. John in the pink, and my husband, Dave Peterson. And excuse me, on the middle image, I'm preparing to photograph, and Dave is oh so carefully removing one of the paintings. Quick sip of water. So what exactly is stabilizing and rehousing? Here you can see Amy Kassemeyer at the back recording the dimensions of each piece. Amy St. John preparing to measure it. It was very confusing having 2 Amy's. And Susan is inserting glassine sheets between each painting and then stacking them gently in these archival quality folders. And then the folders go into these boxes that you can see back here. In the meantime, Dave was assigning each work with a number and making labels, and I was photographing each painting with its number. It took all 5 of us a solid 3 days to process about 300 paintings. We did the original 275 and got started on the new ones, and then we ran out of time and materials to get through the whole process. But here's a couple of them. Here's one that thrills me the most. When I wrote the book, there was no surviving artwork of Sara's from the Catalinas, home of Mount Lemmon. But this one showed up in the new box. And as you can see, it's signed and dated on the back, September 1883, Santa Catalina region. Here's another one. This one has 2 plants. The white is Pringle's cluster vine and the blue is a morning glory. And on the back, she wrote Santa Catalina Mountains, September 1883, Box Canyon. And that's quite likely that what used to be called Box Canyon is now known as the Tucson Wash. Here's the actual plant. Here's one of my favorite wildflowers, the Mexican star, mixed in with some blue grama grass. And on the back, she's written, she did this one in the Huachucas on September 18th, 1883, at Igo's Ranch. So many of her illustrations are in the books that they produced, but of course, they're all reproduced in black and white. Interestingly, this book was copyrighted in Sara's name. And the illustrations are beautiful, but they're, because of the times of and reproduction techniques, they're a little hard to see, but this one is still a lovely one. You can see her her signature here. And in those boxes, I kept thinking I really wanted to see the originals of these paintings. And there is the original of that particular painting. You see there's her signature. Here's another example of one that's in black and white. This one was from a J.G.'s books about pines of the Pacific Slope. And here's the original. I mentioned how fragile the paper is. You can see that even this piece, I think, goes right there. Handling them as carefully as we could, they're still very, they have a tendency to crumble. The dark paper doesn't age well. And here's another example of the dark paper where you can see that the whole image is just cracking. I was intrigued by what this was up here. So once I had the image, I blew it up in Photoshop, and it turns out it's her signature, Mrs. S.A.P. Lemmon, and your guess is as good as mine about what the date is. So what's next? You would think that now that the book is out, that I should be done with Sara by now, but it now appears that Sara and I will be joined for a while longer. My husband, Dave, says he feels as if he's married two women, Sara Lemmon and me. And with the recent discovery of these 200 paintings, phase 2 will continue on. The really exciting news is that as of yesterday and this morning, we received a very large personal donation from an individual, and we now have enough money to go ahead and schedule the rehousing and stabilization of the rest of those 2 boxes, which is just thrilling. After that, various ideas of what would happen next are starting to percolate. If you have any ideas, please do contact me. Somebody suggested that I should talk to Taylor Sheridan, producer of the Yellowstone series, about making a movie of Sara's life. I can promise you that if I have anything to do with that, Sara will not be appearing naked in a horse trough. And those of you who've seen Yellowstone will understand that, I think. If you'd like to be kept informed about this project and the ongoing preservation, I do send out a newsletter. Each one has snippets about Sara. It's free. I try to keep it relatively short, and I only send it out if I have something to announce. And if you email me at wynne@wynnebrown.com, I can add you as a subscriber. The book is available, as I said, wherever you buy books, and I encourage you to use independent bookstores. And if you like, I can also send you a signed book plate like this one here. Just email me with what you want the book plate to read and your snail mail address. So that's where the Sara Lemmon project is for now, and I hope you agree with me that Sara is another hidden figure of both science and art, and she so deserves a mountain in her name and a book, and that her work so deserves to be preserved. And you could also, most likely, understand why it is I am such a huge fan of archivists. Thank you again, Yum, for inviting me. And at this point, I will be very happy to unshare my screen. Let's see, stop share, and take any questions. And
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. This is really a wonderful and fascinating presentation. Someone did ask if if the recording will be made available. So just to let everybody know, this recording will be made available next week on our YouTube channel. Everybody who signed up to attend today's presentation will receive a link to that once it's available. We also have 2 comments. Someone just wanted to say that they really enjoyed how people work. So thank you very much for sharing all that information. Another person said fascinating. Thanks very much. Another person wants to know, do you know how many plants she and her husband discovered?
I've read that 1/3 of Arizona's vascular plants with stems, are credited to have been discovered by them, which is a lot. Of course, they're not all named for them, but there are, if you Google plants with Lemmoni as a species name, you'll find many. A lot of them are in California, and a lot of them are here in Arizona. Sometimes people say, well, she left such a legacy here in Arizona. But, why didn't University of Arizona publish this book? And the answer is that University of Arizona was very interested because her legacy is pretty big here. But when you think about it, Sara only spent 8 months of her entire life in Arizona. And I couldn't stretch 8 months into a whole book. But given both the plants and the mountain, she left quite a legacy.
Yeah, another person wanted to know about the preservation for the remainder of the painting. So you mentioned that you do now have the funds to do that. Do you know what the schedule is going to be like and how that's going to work?
The scheduling is always tricky because we have to fit, our schedule is pretty flexible, and we're happy to dump any responsibilities in order to go to Berkeley and work on this. But it has to fit in around the student body because the archives are pretty busy with students during the school year. And it also depends on the archivist's schedule. And then it also depends on the art conservator's schedule because although she's retired, she travels a lot. So trying to coordinate all that. And then I just think it's absolutely wonderful that we're also working with Sara's great grandniece, and Amy St. John and I have become good friends during this whole process, which is hugely relieving because, when you, and those of you who write history or biographies can imagine when you're rummaging around in somebody's family attic, you really don't want them to be unhappy with whatever it is that you write. And fortunately, she and the family are very happy with the book. So the scheduling, it will most likely, last year, what worked out best was August before school started. And that's, I'm thinking August or sometime this summer is probably going to be when it'll happen. And this time we're going to allow more time because we were slammed trying to get the 300 paintings processed. And this time I think I'm going to try to save 4 to 5 days.
Yeah, trying to cram it all into a day or two, it just feels like too much.
And plus, it's just magical being there, actually handling these pieces of paper that were in the huachucas. And Sara was there, in her heavy broadcloth dress, looking over her shoulders for the rumored Apaches. And then to actually be there holding these is amazing. It's just magical. And I like having the time to be able to soak that up and enjoy it and not just focused on, okay, get this measurement, write this number down.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question, do you know anything about her relationship with Alice Eastwood?
There is one mention in the letters, and that's all I know. They were there at the same time, and I would love to know if Alice was able to save, because Alice is credited with saving a lot of specimens during the earthquake, and there is a postcard that JG wrote to Alice saying, we hope you're well and, managing in these difficult times, because it took people many, many months. And the Lemmons took in a lot of refugees. They turned their whole house into basically a boarding house for people who had lost their place. In Oakland, The only damage that their house had was some cracked windows and the chimney fell down. But of course, in San Francisco itself, it looked, I think, a lot like what Turkey looks like today. There were just piles of rubble in many places.
Another question. Who did the actual classification and naming of the plants? Traditionally, those who discover don't use their own names.
Right. Those who discover them can put in a request, but it was Asa Gray at Harvard or his assistant, Serena Watson, who actually did the plant description. And the plant descriptions are very technical, very dry reading. And they'll tell you how many petioles it has and how many millimeters long they are. And they're the ones who assign a name. And the world was small at that point, but still, Asa Gray was being inundated. I hate to think of the mailbags that showed up in his office. And everybody was hoping that a plant would be named for them, which is one reason there was so much frenetic botanic activity. Everybody wanted something named for them.
Of course. That's how we remember people.
Yes.
Ideally. Another comment and question. I'm not sure if this is pronounced curatus of the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill Herbarium. We curate plants collected by the Lemmons, and I'm looking forward to using information in your book to assign latitude, longitude to the specimens. Do you know if someone, possibly a California or Arizona herbaria, are already doing this?
That's a really good question. One issue is that Asa Gray chastised J.G. Lemmon quite frequently because J.G.'s notes were very casual. And Sara's, I think, were much tidier, and I've seen them. If you go on the biodiversity website, you can see a lot of the field notes. But in those days, a lot of times people put the plant down as to being located where they were camping, not necessarily the exact place where the plant was. So it might be on the wrong, it might be facing north rather than facing south. So it's really hard to have the specific data. It'd be great to contact the herbarium at Arizona, and because they have some of the plants, and I'd be really interested to know what specimens you have, and I'll look at the Q&A later and see who you are. But by all means, reach out to me, Wynne at wynnebrown.com, and I'm happy to put you in touch with anybody I can. Great question.
Wonderful. A person is wondering what the process was like getting the book represented on Reading Arizona as an ebook. So for those who don't know, we also have a platform called Reading Arizona that offers free ebooks and audiobooks to anybody residing in Arizona. And your ebook is available on there. So do you know anything about that process, about having it turned into an ebook?
When I turned the book, when I signed the contract, I agreed to the fact it would be both in print and in ebook. I kept the performance rights because I didn't know if Sara would eventually become a play or a movie. What that meant was that later on, I relinquished the audiobook rights. But as far as the process, that happens at the publisher, and I saw the proofs and approved them. But as far as how it actually happens behind the scenes, I really don't know. I know how I produce books, but that's a whole different thing, and in design and all that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, and we have time for just one more question. I was wondering, how has your work on Sara changed how you see and interact with nature and flowers in particular? How has it impacted that?
I'm a very slow trail runner. And so I'm out a lot in the Catalinas or out in the Rincons, and I swear I have her voice in my ear, and every time I look over at the Catalinas, I think about her. She's really increased my appreciation for observing carefully and appreciating the diversity of what we have here. It's astounding. And I'm so grateful that I've had the opportunity to tell her story.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Great. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly with everybody. Um, this will, there we go. And also, all right. So oh no, where did it go? I'm sorry, everybody. So sorry,
Oh,
everybody.
don't you love technology?
I know, just having technical difficulties. So I am not going to, okay, you can hopefully just see this. So at any rate, thank you again so much, Wynne, and for everybody for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this presentation as much as I did. On the screen, there is a link to a survey. It's also in the chat. Please fill it out if you have a few moments. It's very short. It's just a few questions, and it'll really help us. And thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you at future events and also in our reading room. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. This was great. Thank you so much.